What would you do if a moment of small-town simplicity turned into something that stopped the whole room cold? Now, picture this: Elon Musk, yes, that Elon Musk, walking into a tiny diner off a back road in Middle America. No fanfare, no entourage, just him in a well-worn baseball cap and a quiet demeanor. But what happened next had nothing to do with his fame, fortune, or even his wild ambitions. It was about a hat, and it changed everything. Here's how it all began. A server, juggling plates with the kind of speed only years of experience can teach, glanced over as Musk sat at the corner booth. She squinted, maybe recognizing him, maybe not. But her expression shifted in an instant. The smile vanished. The welcoming tone she had for everyone else? It wasn't there. She approached, and in a voice that was low but deliberate, she said, "I'm sorry. We can't serve you." Imagine that. Elon Musk, the man behind Tesla, SpaceX, denied service over a hat. The diner, filled with the hum of breakfast conversations and the clink of cutlery, fell into an uneasy quiet. Every eye turned toward that corner booth. People whispered, "Is that him? What's going on?" Some reached for their phones, others just stared, frozen in the moment. Musk, for his part, didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. Instead, he calmly asked, "Is there a problem?" The server, now visibly uncomfortable, replied, "It's our policy. No hats inside the diner. It's nothing personal." Now, you might think this is the part where tempers flare or accusations fly, but no. Musk nodded, removed the cap, and handed it over. That should have been the end of it, right? But it wasn't. The atmosphere didn't ease up. Whispers grew louder. Some applauded him for complying, others muttered about rules that seemed too rigid. Yet, the tension didn't seem to bother him. Musk sat there, quietly sipping his coffee, eyes scanning the room, not with frustration, but with curiosity, as if he was observing something bigger than the moment itself. And then, something happened that no one could have expected. A man seated at the counter, a regular, by the looks of him, stood up. He walked over to Musk, put a hand on his shoulder, and said, "I'm sorry about that. Folks around here don't always handle things the way they should." He looked back at the server and added, "Let me cover his meal." The room went dead silent again. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the hat anymore. It was about the simple act of someone stepping forward, breaking the tension, and offering a gesture of kindness. Musk thanked him, shook his hand, and stayed a little longer. When he finally left, he didn't just leave a tip, he left enough money to cover the meals of everyone in the diner that morning. Not as a statement, but as a quiet act of generosity that spoke volumes. Now, think about this. Was this about enforcing rules or making a stand? Was it about pride, humility, or something deeper about human connection? And here's the kicker, no one even noticed until later, but that well-worn hat he was asked to remove? It wasn't just any hat. It had a simple embroidered logo, Hope. So, tell me, what would you have done? If you're still here, thank you for watching. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop it in the comments below. And if this story moved you even a little, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Your support helps us share moments that remind us all of what really matters. See you next time. As the door closed behind Musk, the diner fell into an odd silence, not awkward, just thoughtful. For a moment, it seemed like the everyday rhythm of the place had been quietly disrupted. People returned to their meals, but you could see it on their faces, they were still thinking about what had happened. The server stood at the counter, wiping her hands on her apron as though trying to shake off the moment. "I didn't even recognize him at first," she admitted to the cook. "But even when I did, it didn't feel right to treat him any differently. I wasn't trying to make it a big deal." At the back of the room, a retired schoolteacher leaned across her table. "You know," she said to her friend, "a lot of folks would have caused a scene. He didn't. Just went along with it like anybody else. Her friend nodded, but the expression on her face suggested she wasn't quite sure how to feel about it all. The owner of the diner arrived a little while later, walking in with the calm authority of someone who had seen her fair share of drama over the years. She listened intently as the staff explained what had happened. When they finished, she leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning the room. "Sometimes, a rule is just a rule," she said thoughtfully. "But people? They're a little more complicated." By the next morning, word of the encounter had spread. The story was being told over cups of coffee in nearby diners, shared on local Facebook groups, and even whispered about at grocery store checkouts. But for all the chatter, one detail stood out: the quiet, understated way Musk had handled it all. And then there was the note. When the server cleared his table, she found it tucked under his coffee cup. It wasn't a complaint or a comment about the policy. It was just 3 words written in neat, deliberate handwriting: "Kindness is enough." The simplicity of it caught everyone off guard. "He didn't have to leave that," the server said later. "But he did. I guess he wanted us to think about more than just the hat." The owner took the note and pinned it to the wall by the register. "We don't get to choose how people treat us," she said to her staff. "But we do get to choose how we treat them. And that's the part people remember." And she was right. In the weeks that followed, the diner saw a surprising surge of new faces. Some came out of curiosity, drawn by the story. Others came because they wanted to see the place where kindness had quietly stolen the show. Now, let me ask you this: if you had been there, in that moment, what would you have done? Would you have followed the rules without question? Or would you have looked at the bigger picture? Thank you for pointing that out. I understand your concerns about avoiding repetition, robotic phrasing, and maintaining an engaging continuation. Allow me to carefully review and rework the script again to ensure it aligns perfectly with your original guidelines, avoids redundancy, and flows seamlessly from where we left off without losing the audience's interest. Here's the refined continuation. Musk sat quietly at his booth, his folded hat resting on the edge of the table. His demeanor was calm, but the air in the diner hadn't yet settled. Conversations had resumed in low murmurs, but every so often, someone's gaze would flicker in his direction, curiosity etched on their face. The owner stayed near the counter, pretending to busy herself with receipts, but her focus remained on the man in the corner. Her earlier conviction was still there, but now it was mingled with something else: hesitation, maybe even regret. Across the room, a little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Is he famous?" he asked, his voice louder than it should have been. His mother hushed him quickly, glancing nervously at Musk, who caught the boy's eye and smiled faintly. It was the kind of smile that made you wonder what he was thinking, but he gave nothing away. Then came another unexpected moment. A man, perhaps in his 60s, wearing a worn-out jacket and a thoughtful expression, stood up from the counter. He walked slowly over to Musk's table, his hands clasped tightly together. "I just wanted to say," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "I don't agree with what happened back there. It didn't sit right with me." Musk looked up, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said, and there was a genuine warmth in his tone. The man nodded, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he turned to the rest of the room. "I know we all have our rules and beliefs," he said, his voice gaining strength. "But sometimes, we forget the most important rule: treat people with respect. Doesn't matter who they are." For a moment, no one said anything. Then, one of the regulars at a nearby table gave a small clap. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just a quiet acknowledgement. Slowly, others joined in, not an ovation, but a ripple of agreement that seemed to shift the energy in the room. The owner watched from behind the counter, her face unreadable. She didn't say anything, but the way she wiped her hands on her apron suggested she was deep in thought. When Musk eventually stood up to leave, he left a generous tip on the table, more than enough to cover his meal and then some. He placed the hat back on his head, nodded politely to the server, and walked toward the door. But before he stepped out, he paused. He looked back at the owner, who had finally come out from behind the counter. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Musk offered her a small but meaningful nod. She didn't speak, but the look on her face seemed to carry the weight of unspoken words. And just like that, he was gone. Now, let me ask you, was this a story about standing your ground or finding common ground? Did the owner's decision strengthen her convictions, or did it reveal something she hadn't considered? If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories that challenge your perspective, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, we'll see you in the next one. Musk didn't move right away. He stood still, not out of hesitation, but as if carefully considering his next step. The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes flicking back and forth between him and the owner. Even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen had stopped, as though the whole diner had frozen in place. The young server by the kitchen door couldn't take her eyes off the scene. Her apron felt tighter than usual, and she fidgeted with its strings, her thoughts racing. She wasn't just watching a customer and a boss, she was witnessing a clash of principles, and it unsettled her in a way she didn't fully understand. And then, Musk broke the silence. "Thank you for explaining," he said, his voice measured and steady. "I respect your policy, even if I don't agree with it." He picked up his hat, glanced around the room, and then, without another word, moved to leave. The doorbell jingled faintly as he stepped outside, and just like that, the moment seemed to pass. But it hadn't, not really. As Musk walked to his car, the young server took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Wait," she called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went still again, all heads turning toward her. She didn't look at her boss. Instead, she looked directly at Musk, her voice trembling but determined. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. That wasn't fair to you." Musk stopped in his tracks and turned back, a slight smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply. "But don't be too hard on anyone. People do what they think is right." Her words seemed to break something loose in the diner. A man at the counter, one of the regulars who had been quietly watching the whole time, pushed back his stool and stood up. "She's right," he said firmly. "That was no way to treat a person, no matter who they are." Another voice chimed in from across the room. "It's just a hat," someone said. "Why make such a big deal out of it?" The owner, still standing by the counter, tightened her jaw but didn't respond. Her grip on the edge of the counter was firm, her knuckles pale, but she stayed silent. Outside, Musk glanced back toward the diner, then climbed into his car. He didn't look angry or upset. If anything, he looked thoughtful, as though this was just another puzzle for him to figure out. Back inside, the energy had shifted. The customers weren't whispering anymore. They were talking openly, debating what had just happened and what it meant. "Do rules really matter that much?" one woman asked, half to herself. "Or is it more important to treat people decently?" The young server, still standing by the door, seemed to draw courage from the moment. She turned to the owner, her voice quieter now but still firm. "Maybe we should think about why we have that rule in the first place," she said. The owner stared at her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Maybe you're right," she admitted softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "Now, let me ask you, if you had been in the diner, how would you have reacted? Would you have spoken up like the server, or stayed quiet like so many others?" Musk nodded gently, acknowledging the server's offer, and took a seat without another word. The atmosphere in the diner shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone watching, grappling with what had just unfolded. The owner stood frozen for a moment, her hands resting on the counter. She glanced at the customers who had spoken up, their faces firm but not unkind. Finally, She sighed and stepped into the kitchen, leaving the young server to take the lead. The server poured a fresh cup of coffee, her hands steady this time. As she placed it on Musk's table, she whispered, "Thank you for understanding." Musk smiled softly. "Thank you for speaking up," he replied. The words carried a weight that didn't need further explanation. But the real turning point wasn't in the coffee or even the gestures of support. It was in what followed. A woman at a nearby table cleared her throat, her voice breaking the quiet hum of resumed conversation. "You know," she said, directing her words toward the room, "it's not about rules or policies. It's about remembering that we're all just people trying to get through the day." Her words sparked something. A man by the window nodded, adding, "He didn't have to be polite. Plenty of folks in his position wouldn't be. But he was. That says a lot." The owner re-emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked at the group, then at Musk, and finally spoke. "I was trying to do what I thought was right," she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. "But maybe I went about it the wrong way." Musk didn't gloat or seize the moment to make a point. Instead, he said, "We all have reasons for what we do. I appreciate you listening." What happened next surprised everyone. The man who had first stood up to support Musk approached the counter and left a $20 bill. "This is for her," he said, pointing to the young server. "It takes guts to stand up and do the right thing." One by one, other customers followed suit. A few left extra tips for the server, others shook her hand or offered a kind word. It wasn't about Musk anymore, it was about the collective realization that a small act of fairness could change the entire tone of a room. By the time Musk finished his coffee, the diner felt lighter, almost renewed. He stood, thanked the server, and left a tip so generous it brought tears to her eyes. Without making a scene, he placed the hat back on his head, nodded to the owner, and walked out into the afternoon sun. The room stayed quiet for a moment after he left, as if everyone was absorbing what had just happened. Finally, the owner broke the silence. "Maybe it's time we rethink a few things around here," she said, almost to herself. "So, what do you think? Was this a story about standing your ground, or learning to bend? Would you have spoken up like the young server or waited to see what happened?" What began as a quiet morning in a small-town diner had now become something unforgettable. Musk's composed response and the courage of a few individuals had shifted the dynamic entirely. The tension that had once hung over the room like a storm cloud gave way to something else, a sense of unity, a shared understanding that everyone there had witnessed something rare and meaningful. The owner, after her quiet retreat to the kitchen, returned with a different energy. Though she didn't say much, her softened expression spoke volumes. She stepped up to the counter, where the young server was handing Musk his coffee, and nodded in quiet approval. It wasn't an apology, but it was a gesture that spoke of reflection, of a willingness to reconsider. By the end of the day, the server, still processing everything that had happened, decided to share her story online. She wrote about the moment Musk chose not to fight but to respond with grace. She wrote about the support of the customers who stood up, the man who left the generous tip for her, and the unexpected transformation of a room filled with strangers. She ended her post with a simple thought: kindness doesn't need to be loud to make an impact. Sometimes, it's the quiet moments that change everything. Within hours, her post began gaining traction. Comments poured in, with people sharing their own stories of choosing kindness over conflict. Some praised Musk's humility, others focused on the bravery of the server and the customers who spoke out. It wasn't about one person, it was about how a single moment could inspire so many to think differently. News outlets picked up the story, adding their own spin on what had happened. Some focused on the debate over rules versus fairness, while others highlighted the owner's subtle but significant change in attitude. But the real impact wasn't in the headlines, it was in the thousands of personal conversations the story sparked. Families discussed it over dinner. Co-workers shared it during coffee breaks. Strangers online found common ground in their reflections. Back at the diner, things felt different in the days that followed. The owner quietly removed the rule about hats, pinning the young server's viral post to the bulletin board instead. Customers who had been there that day returned, bringing friends who wanted to hear the story firsthand. And the young server, who had once felt unsure of her place, found a new confidence in her ability to stand for what mattered. So, what do you take away from this? Was it Musk's quiet humility, the courage of a single voice, or the collective strength of a room full of people choosing decency over division? Let us know in the comments how this story resonates with you. If it inspired you, leave a like and subscribe for more stories that remind us all of the impact we can have, one small moment at a time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.